So welcome everybody. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Kathy Shoemaker. Kathy's an assistant professor of professional practice in the Department of Ed Psych at the GSE. She has a degree in computer science and then more recently went back to school and got her PhD. Well, she got a master's in counseling, and then she got her PhD in counselor education at Montclair State. And so she's been now working with us at the GSE. And so it is my great pleasure to have Kathy, and she's going to talk about the work that she has done on mindful awareness skills. So Kathy, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And I gather, Colleen, from what you said, that almost everyone is a doc student in the room.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of where I am looking at, focusing on. So as I said before, I completed my dissertation in 2017. I have been a school counselor, a prevention specialist going into schools, doing prevention work within schools. And at the same time as I was doing that, I was actually working in a substance abuse treatment program for adolescents and young adults. And one of the things that there was a lasting impression on me was that it was far more fun and easier to do prevention work than it was when you were working on the addiction side of things to people create change. And so that was kind of the impetus for my my research. And I always found it interesting as to how people chose the research that they do within the PhD program. And for me, like early on, like my first degree is in computer science, which has served me well in a lot of ways because it allowed me to think in a lot of ways like a researcher thinks. You have to systematically go through this process in order to do the work. So I never really expected to work with kids. It wasn't something that I had wanted to do. And yet there was a call at church for somebody who would step up and work with the youth group. And I wound up working with teenagers and just finding that I loved it. My parents also had a lot of trauma in their early childhood that I think had kind of been percolating back there. So these two things kind of came together. And once I started working with kids, I couldn't imagine doing anything different. So I wound up going back to school, became a school counselor and a licensed professional counselor in the process along the way. And so, as I said, it was that idea of prevention was so much more impactful than trying to work with people once they already were dealing with addiction. And how would I go about being able to do that? And some of the work that I had done in schools allowed me to see that as I went along. So in the meantime, I wound up reading a book called Teaching with the Brain in Mind, which led me down this pathway to exploring more about neuroscience as I wound going along. And that actually led me to mindfulness. So mindfulness wasn't something I was originally planning to study. It kind of came out of the more research I did on neuroscience, the more they talked about how mindfulness was this great opportunity to help people change their brains in ways that made education for them more effective and all aspects of their lives. So that became the way that I wound up doing my research. So this is my, just the kind of the flow, and I'm comfortable with, if you want to ask questions along the way, that's perfectly fine. Although I think you have everybody muted, so I don't know if they can unmute themselves or not. But if not, I guess if you can type in the chat, I think somebody said that they'd be kind of monitoring that.
Yep, that's if they want to chat or either way, they should be able to unmute themselves.
Okay, great. So John Kabat-Zinn says that mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in a particular way. And that particular way is being open, curious, and without judgment. And we can think about how many times we're thinking about something and that judgment is creeping in, particularly about ourselves and how we're doing. And in middle school, that is really, that self judgment, it can be really harsh at that particular point in time. So Ellen Langer says, when we engage in mindful learning, we avoid forming mindsets that unnecessarily limit us. It leads us to greater sensitivity to context, perspective, and ultimately to a greater control over our lives. And in my work as being a school counselor, one of the things that I noticed is that my students who were failing academically or struggling academically, more often than not, it was not about them not having the academic ability to do it, because oftentimes they weren't even trying. It was about the mindset that they had already put around education and around what they were doing, or the different things going on in their, either in the school environment or in their home environments, that was really impacting their academic success. And so I just saw that as a huge roadblock in a lot of ways. So I was often working in that area with my students. I wasn't working on helping them do more math problems. I was working on helping them see that they had the ability to create change in their lives. So looking at this from the lens of adolescent development, sorry, I just need to move this off of my screen. Adolescence is a developmental period that has a lot of asynchronous changes. Think about the average adolescent. They're changing physically, cognitively, emotionally, socially, all at different rates at the same time. And then we go into classrooms that have every one of them doing this all at the same time, and how that can impact what's going on. Sorry, my screen is not working. Okay, so the onset of all of this affects the way that students manage their emotions and stress, how they engage with other people, and how they learn. So from a neurobiological perspective, neuroplasticity, the process of this change in our brains, is neither positive or negative. It just is. What we practice more is what gets hard, the stronger connections within our brain. So adolescence, other than infancy and toddlerhood, is a great opportunity to create change in a quick way, because their brains are changing so rapidly that you can create some of these changes and have them become stronger rather quickly. So from that perspective, the goal is to help them develop cognitive, emotional, and social assets that can help them with their student engagement and with their personal accomplishments. Two of the risk factors that go on in this time is the average age of onset for anxiety and depression is now down at like 13 or below. And those things can lead to disengagement, for one thing, but a whole host of things that can change the trajectory of the lifespan if they're not dealt with early. So these rapid brain changes during adolescence set up this second chance for a healthy trajectory for students who maybe have not had that, and also, strengthens it for those who have. So I looked at two parameters: student engagement with school and test anxiety. And as I was doing my research, we were in the midst of, this craze around testing. I think as, I had left school the one year that we're doing 60 days of testing of standardized testing within the school. Now, each student wasn't having a total of 60 days, but any of you who've worked in schools know that any day you're having standardized testing kind of throws off the rhythm of what's going on in school and tends to also add anxiety. So student engagement, one of the things we know automatically is that with the transition to middle school, student engagement tends to drop. Oh, I just turned that off. I don't understand. Sorry about that. So student engagement can be altered in positive and negative ways based on interactions and relationships and things that they're learning inside and outside of school. And then promoting student engagement leads to better outcomes among students. They've found for students with racial and ethnic minority status, for students with immigrant parents, and also for students that are living within low SES families. And it also happens to be an important predictor of long-term outcomes, including the students' education level, job possibilities, life satisfaction, and the avoidance of risky behaviors. So test anxiety also rises during middle school. I don't know that I said this, but I did my research in middle school. So test anxiety, when they look at it, it encompasses various things: physiological arousal, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral factors, and a sense of social pressure that students may feel. And it can be manifested in physical symptoms, debilitating thoughts and feelings, or off-task behaviors. Almost every year when standardized tests come around, there are kids that are like throwing up on their test book, or, you know, too sick to come to school, stomach aches, things like that. So that's like the physical symptoms. But the debilitating thoughts and feelings are actually have been shown to have a bigger impact. The term cognitive obstruction. And what they're learning is that up to almost 50% of your working memory can get used up with this ruminating and the cognitive obstruction that's going on, which makes you have that much less to use for the computational things you're trying to do while taking tests. And oftentimes it manifests more in high stake tests than, if someone's taking a spelling test. So someone may do fine on the day-to-day tasks in the classroom, but if they deem something to be high stakes, then it kind of has a bigger effect. So it can distract and interfere with the ability to process information. And it's also negatively associated with academic performance, student self-efficacy, and self-regulation, which are all positively correlated with student engagement. So students who have high levels of test anxiety are more likely to receive lower grades and test scores, may have poor study skills, difficulty concentrating and learning new material in class, being able to put forth effort and show less persistence, avoid setting high goals, show poor motivation, and have higher levels of generalized anxiety and depression, suicidal thoughts, and feelings of hopelessness. So you can see that test anxiety has a lot of negative consequences for people who are experiencing it. And yet it's kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know if they're doing more about it now, but when I was working in schools, if someone didn't meet proficiency, no one was testing them for test anxiety. They were just putting them in a remedial class to do more math work or to spend more time on their language skills. And yet test anxiety can account for a fair amount of difference in test scores. So 40 to 60% of students are disengaged by the time they reach high school. And now this isn't all necessarily bad news. I mean, they have higher engagement when they're younger. As they start to have more things going on in their lives, they have more things that they're selecting their interests in. And as a result, they are less engaged in school. So not, not having as high a level of student engagement isn't automatically a negative. But that the lower, when it does get lower, there are higher chances of things like dropping out of school, failing courses, and things like that. So it's important to assess what's going on for students and to help them feel engaged and connected to school, but not expect that they're going to, revert to levels that they had when they were younger, when they didn't have so many things that they were choosing from. So high school dropout rates have been dropping consistently, with a good thing, because for a long time that they were high, but we still do have dropping out happening, and student engagement is a part of that. So test anxiety, more than a third of all students in public schools experience it to some level. And between 4 and 15% of the variance in test scores can be attributed to test anxiety. And what I learned being a school counselor and looking at a lot of standardized test scores, there were an awful lot of students that got a 195. So even that on the 4% end, there was a whole lot of students that would have been considered proficient, not for, if their test anxiety had been accounted for, possibly. So just some demographics around the adolescent age group. 40% of adolescents live in low SES homes. Low SES, some students with racial and ethnic minority status, students with disabilities tend to experience higher rates of test anxiety and also higher rates of disengagement from school. In general, girls experience higher test anxiety and boys have higher rates of disengagement with school. So my study examined whether teaching mindful awareness skills to middle school students would impact their engagement with school and their experience of test anxiety. So my theoretical lens looked at this through the lens of positive psychology, developmental science, specifically positive youth development, some theories of learning, prevention science, which is universal interventions, which multi-tiered systems of support has become a hot topic in schools these days. And basically universal interventions is you want to do something for the entire population that impacts everyone, but the research has shown tends to impact students who are more vulnerable with greater results. And then, so interpersonal neurobiology was the lens I looked at from the counseling aspect, as well as contemplative science. And then finally, within the school counseling realm, the American School Counseling Association has mindsets and behaviors for student success and how those would be impacted. So interpersonal neurobiology is basically this idea that the mind, the body, the mind, the brain, and relationships are all intertwined in how somebody is processing information. And the key here is that, a lot of people would say, well, the mind is the brain and the brain is the mind. And it's not exactly the case, right? The brain is this physical structure. The mind is kind of controlling the physical structure. So it's much harder you can't pick out and say, here's the mind. The mind manifests through the brain, but the brain itself is just a physical structure. It's the mind that is doing the control of that structure through thinking. And, so development across the lifespan happens in this context of biology, ecology, and relationships with others, and then the self. So if we look at like newborns or young children, we regulate so they learn to self-regulate. We soothe so they learn to self-soothe. And that process doesn't just end. Middle school, that adolescent stage kind of goes through this stage again where they need some help with framing around that self-soothing, self-regulation, and how to maneuver through relationships and such. So in this model, this integration of mind-brain relationship and it working well creates wellness or well-being across the person. And then mindfulness has been shown to promote this integration. And so that is the intervention that I chose to use. So benefits of mindfulness for adolescents. From a therapeutic factors, it helps to relieve stress, lower anxiety and depression. It improves positive mood and reduces negative mood, and enhances social, emotional, behavioral, and physical health outcomes. That's a lot of things, but the research on mindfulness has just been exploding over the last decade. There's thousands of articles written every year at this point related to the impact of mindfulness. And when I started my research, there wasn't so much related to youth in particular and schools, but that is burgeoning as well. So from the neural factors, it improves attention, cognitive control, and emotional regulation, and it addresses the risks of impulsivity and the ability to stay on task. And so one of the interesting things about mindfulness is one of the things that they realize is that it does allow you to have better cognitive control, meaning that, you know, you are more in control of your emotions and your emotional states and such. But an interesting thing that the MRIs, I mean, the different scans that they're doing right now is it shows even short bursts of using mindfulness, not only does the cognitive control help, but it also seems to change the amygdala in ways that makes it less reactive to negativity and negative emotions in a way that you can be responsive rather than reactive. So that's a really important thing when we're talking about adolescence. And then it's also been shown to increase a sense of competence, creativity, positive affect, memory, health, well-being, and longevity. So it sort of sounds like a magic bullet, you know, which it isn't necessarily, but you know, it can have a major impact on people's lives if they learn how to use it as we go along. Now, one of the things that kept popping up throughout as I was going along, which wasn't another thing I was going to add into my dissertation as I was going along, but trauma kept coming up. And what I've learned along the way is that mindfulness can be helpful for everyone, but you do need to plan for creating a sense of safety and grounding and resourcing because people who have trauma can be triggered. So for instance, I teach my students how to use mindfulness and how to teach mindfulness to their students. Because one of the things that someone who's been traumatized, they don't like to feel like they don't have control. So I invite people to close their eyes as opposed to telling them they need to close their eyes. We may, you know, help them to figure out, you know, how to, you know, be grounded with things like planting their feet on the floor. If they're feeling overwhelmed, to open their eyes, those kinds of things. And then, you know, just giving them resources before we do mindfulness. And the thing is that, you know, we think about mindfulness and mindful breathing. So I might teach them how to have an anchor spot. But there's lots of aspects of mindfulness that is not just, you know, breathing exercises and closing your eyes. Ellen Langer talks a lot about mindful learning and the ability to put your attention in the present moment into what you're learning as well. So, you know, there's a aspects of mindfulness that go beyond various breathing exercises. So mindfulness in schools, again, present moment, non-judgmental focus is the key thing. It helps students to observe maladaptive thoughts, emotions, and beliefs, but also accept them that they're transitory and subject to change rather than a personal defect. And I think that that's a really important thing when we think about that adolescent time frame where they're continuously comparing themselves to other people and finding themselves coming up short. So if they can look at the various things that are going on and just see that they're part of life and part of what happens rather than a personal defect, it helps them to better be able to manage their emotions. So mindfulness also counteracts the negativity bias, which is very strong in adolescence, but we all have it. And it also promotes compassionate behavior to oneself and then also to others. And social emotional learning has been shown to help improve attitudes, behaviors, social and emotional skills, and academic achievement. One of the interesting things that has been found with social emotional learning is that students can learn them really well. But if something triggers them, they kind of go out the window at the point because they're now reacting instead of being able to respond. And so from that perspective, adding a component of mindfulness has been very helpful, where it kind of helps to shift that reactivity and help students become less likely to be triggered as they go along. A key thing is universal prevention. And I mentioned before that multi-tiered systems of support are becoming pretty regular in schools these days as well. And that's the idea we do something for the entire population that helps to support everyone, because everyone's at risk of higher anxiety in middle school, everyone's at risk for higher depression, but it also seems to have the greatest gains among vulnerable students. And it also doesn't pull students out and sort of ostracize them because they're getting some kind of special intervention, when these skills are things that are helpful for all of our students. So mindfulness interventions have been shown to both enhance social emotional learning by increasing the ability for self-regulation and reducing reactivity. Okay, so the importance of the study, based on the onset of anxiety and depression, we're looking to intervene early to help impact both academic outcomes, but also their social emotional development and the life course trajectory. And then from a neurodevelopmental adolescence is this time for the intervention. And mindfulness-based social emotional learning programs have showed that improving self-regulation, cognition have been shown to improve these things, as well as there's been research on lowering anxiety and depression. And so I was testing for test anxiety. And both of these things impact student engagement. So my research questions. To what extent does teaching mindful awareness skills to middle school students predict change in student engagement and predict change in students' level of test anxiety? And then I looked at these characteristics to see if there was a moderation in the relationship: gender, race and ethnicity, SES, language spoken at home, and disability status. So my hypothesis was that teaching mindful awareness would predict student engagement and test anxiety, and that those variables would impact the moderation of the relationship. So I used a quasi-experimental pre- and post-test design with the control group. Both of them were tested, were given the pre-test. The intervention group was given the mindful awareness intervention. They were post-tested, and and then I analyzed the data both for engagement and for test anxiety. The way that I did this was I did the intervention in health class. And so the intervention group was the current health class, and the control group was the just passed class that had been in there and was back in their PE class. So they all had the same teachers within the class. So hopefully the main difference was that the intervention group got the mindful awareness intervention. So there's my hypothesis, that my intervention group would be different from my control group at time 2. So I used, my independent variables were mindfulness, which I measured by 2 things, the child and adolescent mindfulness measure and the healthy self-regulation scale, which also measures the regulation aspects of mindfulness. Then my dependent variables were the student engagement, student school engagement scale, and a brief version of the Friedman test anxiety scale. And then, as I mentioned before, these were my control variables. Most of them, the students filled out themselves in the pre-test, but we did have a linking code to the school's database that allowed me to gather disability status and free and reduced lunch information that stood in for low SES without the students having to fill that in. I actually wound up using the printout had race and ethnicity. This would be an interesting thing to realize. I had students that really were not happy about having to fill in their race and ethnicity information. For instance, I had students who their family was from India, and they decided that they were American Indian. And they actually did kind of balk about having to choose things. And so what they wound up choosing was American Indian. And so knowing that there were no American Indian students within the school population, and knowing that the student had kind of voiced displeasure with the question, that was his solution. And so I think that if you can gather the information in a different way, it may be better. In particular, it seems that for middle school students, they aren't necessarily comfortable having to talk about their race and ethnicity as part of what they're doing in these kinds of interventions. So just something to note as you go along. So my survey was 63 questions. 7 of them were demographic questions, 10 of them from the mindfulness inventory, and the other 12 from the self-regulation that made up my mindfulness scale. The student engagement scale had 22 questions, and the test anxiety had 12. And then at post-test for my intervention group, I used 6 qualitative types of questions to gather information. And I guess they're not totally qualitative because I was using a Likert scale. Some of them were asking about how much they liked the interventions, but there were also questions that were there regarding like what they liked, what they used, questions like that. And that was actually recommended to me by by a professor that I kind of went and gathered some information from. And I would say that it was something I hadn't thought about, but if you have the opportunity, you may want to consider using that. Her point was that, you know, if data doesn't come out the way that you want, at least you have something else that you can be using to be reporting on as you went along. Now, that wasn't my hope, but it was helpful to have that information to be able to report back afterwards. I reported back to the school as well. And then, as I said, the school provided a linking code so I could see student disability and free lunch status without having to report that. So, you know, to raise the accuracy. Okay, so the data collecting, I used 3 6th and 3 8th grade classes that were scheduled for health during marking period 4. That was, and then the control group was the same classes from marking period 3 with the same teachers and pretty much the same demographic makeup, my group was, the intervention group had a little bit higher number of African American students and a higher number of special education students. I was able to use the opt-out procedure for getting consent. If you're working in schools, if you can use this, you want to. If I had had to gather all those permission slips from people, I probably would still not be done with my dissertation yet. So based on that, there was very little harm or any harm that was going to come to students from doing from doing it, and because it was built into their regular class period, they had to do it whether they had to do the intervention, whether they consented to be part of the study or not. I was able to use the opt-out option. And students were able to assent at both the pre and post test as to whether or not they wanted to participate or not. So we did the pre-survey in the computer lab during their scheduled health class or their PE class. I administered the assessment. I basically had built it online, which was great because it meant that I had the results right there. I didn't have to do something to tabulate all of the responses with paper as we went along. The mindfulness intervention was one 30-minute session and two 15-minute sessions a week for 4 weeks. So it was a total of 9 sessions. It was an hour. It was 2.5 hours total of the intervention. The control group basically just went back to phys ed class as they usually had. And then at the end of the intervention, both took the same online survey, plus those 6 questions for the intervention group. So I learned a lot of things about doing things in school. My initial study was supposed to be in marking period 2, and due to some things out of my control, it wound up being pushed to marking period 3, which then happened to include all of the state testing, which moved it out pretty much to marking period 4. I would not recommend doing research in marking period 4 if you don't have to do that. Student engagement is going down, and I can show that now. Well, interestingly though, from the subscales, it's that productivity was the main reason student engagement went down. And you kind of see that in classrooms, having spent years with kids, that towards the end of the year, everything's just sort of dropping off as far as how engaged they are in school. So I had to look at my data, and it became kind of obvious that there was some confounding that was going on. The control group, originally, they were going to be pre and post tested in their health classes, but because at least for the first time, and then they would know what was going on, and they would have the opportunity, to do the just one post test out of their gym classes. But based on the timing, the semester had changed, and I had to pre and post test them out of their gym classes. And there wasn't anyone to explain that, someone was coming in and going to be doing this. They kind of just rounded everybody up and sent them off with me. And so students were not particularly happy about doing it, particularly at the post-test point. I also had some interesting, when I was doing it within the health classes, the health teachers brought them down to the classroom. They stayed, kind of helped kids get logged onto the computers and such, which when I was doing the post-test, there was no one, just me, at least for the first time around. And so I was trying to help students get logged on, try to give instructions to this group that wasn't even sure why they were there or what they were doing. And some of the dispositions of the students kind of had an effect. So I actually had a student who was trying to tell other people to, cheat on, on the test. Just put all 0s or put all 1s, which was kind of a funny thing because, and this would be the importance of making sure you have some way of detecting deception within your assessment. For instance, the mindfulness scale, if you scored all zeros, it was reverse scored. And so the people who thought that they were kind of like, haha, we're giving you what we're putting in all zeros, actually came out as highly mindful based on the way that the scores were reversed. So it would be really important to know that. But based on my assessments, I could see, like if somebody did all zeros and ones, some of the other assessments definitely had a reverse scoring that happened in the middle. So I could see that this wasn't somebody who was reading the questions or doing anything related to it. So that was something that I needed to look at. And then there was an attrition rate issue. So for the classes that were in the health class, like I said, they came down with the teacher, they went back with the teacher, both at pre and at post test. In the control group, you know, if people didn't hear their names called or didn't, you know, their section called, they may not have come in the first place, or there may have been a lot of students that were absent. It had just, you know, for the pre-test, the standardized testing had just ended. A lot of students were in and out of school. And the same at the end. So I had a lot of students that either only took the pre-test or only took the post-test or only assented to one or the other, particularly within the control group. So there was a level of attrition. And Mills and Gay say that you have to take the attrition rate into account and not just believe that it's random, that you need to look to see if there's something that is actually systemic about it, which is what I kind of found in mine. So it led to concerns about the fidelity of my post-test results, particularly for the control group, and the representativeness of the control group at post-test. And you don't need to look at all these numbers, but basically what this is showing is that what happened with the control group is the least engaged and those with the highest test scores dropped out, making the control group more engaged and having less test anxiety. With the intervention group, overall it was pretty consistent throughout, or people who were dropping actually were the ones with lower test anxiety and higher engagement. So the decision was made that we had wanted to do a control group for the pre and post test, that I was going to just assess my control group, my intervention group at post test to see what the results were. And so one of the things I would recommend is flexibility and looking for, you know, what options are along the way. And the way that I did the procedure of looking is I took the students who opted out at the post-test, but had given assent, either all the students that gave assent at pre and post, or the ones who gave assent at pre-test. And I just looked at the pre-test scores to assess where everyone was at. And that was, you know, how I was able to determine that the control group was no longer representative. So the intervention group sample looked like this. At the end, I had started out with a sample of 300, total sample of 363. But when you started to pair needing to pair pre and post test data, I had 107 students in the intervention group, and I think about 84 in the control group. So I wound up with the sample of 107, which was not nearly as rigorous as when I had, you know, over 300 students. But this is the population. It was more female than male. You can see a higher concentration of 12 and 14-year-olds. It was the end of the school year, so a lot of those students that had started the year off as 11 and 13-year-olds were now had birthdays. It was, you know, 53 to 47 in the number within the grades. Low SES was 30%. English as a second language was about a quarter. My disability status was about 13. The population in general was 14 point something. So it was, but my Latino Hispanic population dropped to about 9%. So those two populations in particular, I needed to be careful in interpreting results. So there were strong correlations between the mindfulness and the assessments that I used to measure student engagement and test anxiety. And then there was some that were found, for instance, at pre-test or post-test, but not the vice versa, based on some of the demographics. So, for instance, low SES was correlated with the regulation scale only at pre-test, and it was negative. If you had low SE, if you were from low SES family, you were less likely to have high self-regulation skills. Same for the English language learners, and this, where it says race, ethnicity, when I was doing the toggle thing, it was white versus non-white. Okay, so I did my tests using running hierarchical multiple regressions. And first we looked at the pre-test data, which accounted for the mindfulness activity. And I did them in two different runs, one with student engagement and one with test anxiety. So running the first one with the various pre-tests, it accounted for 62.8% of the variance to start with. And then adding in the intervention, that added another 6.6%. The demographic information, another 1.7. So at the end, the model itself explained 76.5% of the variance for student engagement. So learning mindful awareness skills predicted student engagement. The one's called mindfulness measure, the other's healthy self-regulation. So in various models, those things were either positive or negative as we went along. So looking at the interactions between awareness and disability and self-regulation and African Americans were moderated. These things moderated the relationship between teaching mindful awareness skills and student engagement. I think the next slide kind of talks about it more. So in general, for my population, student engagement started high and remained high. Although I said it did kind of drop off, but all of the drop off was accounted for basically by a drop in productivity at the end of the year. While it remained pretty much the same, there were two things. Student engagement for students with disabilities and African American students, which was lowest at pre-test, increased over the intervention. And then for Asian students had the highest engagement both at pre and post-test. And there was some subscales to the student engagement scores. And our Hispanic students had a drop in belonging scores, which without doing further research, I wouldn't really be able to quite understand what that is. And we also, based on that population being so small, I would have to do more exploration on that as well. But the thing with the students with disabilities definitely had a large increase, as well as African American students having a significant increase from pre-test to post-test in student engagement. So the key thing of the subscores for students with disabilities was their aspiration scores increased. And as I said, the belonging scores decreased. So if that helped students with disabilities have a better view of their aspirations, that would be a helpful thing. And then between group differences, African American and Asian students had a negative correlation, but it didn't at pre-test, but it didn't persist at post-test. So in the post-test, where differences were that were negative for a group, and they moderated to no longer being a difference, there was the ability to see that while there may not have been a significant change, they had moved kind of into the same range as the rest of the class. And that's some of what they talk about within universal design, is that we have students that are struggling that get a bigger bump from these programs than, I mean, everyone gets an increase, but it's bigger for students that had a deficit or were vulnerable in the first place. So for test anxiety and the other two mindfulness assessments at the beginning were 40% of the increase. Adding in the post-test added another 8.4%, then adding in the demographics another 2. And finally, this accounted for about 55% of the variance. So each one I was adding in new demographics as we're going along and looking at the interaction. So learning the mindful awareness skills predicted test anxiety. So this is an interesting thing. It predicted higher test anxiety. So that wouldn't necessarily be what one would be hoping for. Looking at the data more carefully, looking at the subscales was really important, because what we found was, while tenseness increased significantly, cognitive obstruction decreased significantly. And so what that kind of showed is that physical tenseness went up for just about everyone, with the exception of a decrease in physical tenseness among African-American students. But it went up across the entire population of Caucasian students. It went up for all females and for all non-low SES students. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a minute. Cognitive obstruction, which is the most debilitating. Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt too much, but we are running, towards the end of time.
Oh,
so
am I at the end already? Oh my goodness. Sorry, I talked way too. So, I mean, sorry. A key thing to know is that in the test anxiety thing, it did go up, which would not be a good thing. But when you looked at the subscales, tenseness went up, cognitive obstruction went down, particularly for girls. A key thing about that is that cognitive obstruction is considered the worst part about test anxiety, the most debilitating part. So the research, one of the things is that research has kind of showed that mindfulness may make people more anxious. So one interpretation from looking at this for me was that perhaps looking at the anxious, perhaps looking at this because of the physical tenseness, maybe they were more tense, but maybe I was teaching them to focus more on what they were noticing in their body. And so what they were noticing was their body more. And so that would be something that would have to be looked at more in the future. So what I wanted to say is students, 50% of them, 75% really liked learning about mindful awareness skills. Half of them said they used it outside of class. Most of them said that liked it, said they liked using it to help calm themselves down, to handle situations or people that were stressful. And the ones that didn't, what they disliked mostly was nothing, or they were bored. It was boring. Some thought it was everything. But in general, students really enjoyed learning about it. It kind of affirmed that universal interventions are an important and useful tool in schools. Thank you for letting me know that I was running out of time, because when I looked before, it was. So I had some recommendations, but what I really would like to do is kind of get to, and you'll be able to look at this if you want. I wanted to get to some of my takeaways. So for those of you that are looking to start early, make connections with schools and school administrators and anybody that you might know. I wound up, it was the place where I had done my prevention work. I had stayed friendly with the SAC counselor there. She would invite me back to things. And, you know, so the principal was pretty comfortable with me when I wanted to go in and do my work there. You want to be identifying assessments and contacting assessment developers. I had some who would not let me use their things for free, and others that were happy to have me doing that. If you can, use opt-out. Build redundancy and plan B possibilities in. You don't want that to be a key focus, but you know, you do want to know that things will go wrong. And so if you can kind of plan for those things, it will be helpful. And have critical friends who can help you assess at every stage of the process. Be flexible and resilient. Choose to do something that you really love. It takes a lot of work to do this, and having the passion helps a lot and makes it fun as you go along. You want to look at confounding data. My initial data showed me that I didn't really have any good results. It took having to look deeper in order to see what was involved there, and that I actually had a good story to tell. And so notes from the field. School schedules will change. You'll have to adjust. Ways you want to be able to measure if there's deception going on. Even if you're doing the intervention yourself, wherever possible, get someone from the school to be helping you. Understand, you know, things like you want to avoid things that might be traumatizing. And then universal design is really becoming a hot topic along the way. And whenever we can do that, it's a good thing to include. And I'm sorry that I got tied up there. Any questions?
Well, thanks so much, Kathy. Really appreciate it. Are there any questions? We have time for a couple comments or questions.
Hi, yeah, I have two questions actually.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Danielle. I'm a second year PhD student. So first of all, I was curious, you said that mindfulness strategies involve more than just breathing. So I was curious, what strategies did you teach the students?
I taught them body scans. I taught them how to identify thoughts, how to identify feelings. I taught them in mindful schools, they call it heartfulness, but you know, kind of like self-compassion or loving kindness meditations, gratitude.
Right, so you did a wide range.
Yeah.
And then I was also curious, so listening to the information you were giving about the study, about test anxiety and about being in middle school and changing environments and things like that, it actually reminded me of COVID, how, you know, so much has changed physically, mentally, emotionally, and how we're all feeling a bit of anxiety. And I felt like the things that you were talking about really applied to what's happening now. And I'm just curious, do you know how your results would apply to other areas like the pandemic? Do you know the crossover into other areas?
I haven't looked at it. I have to say I've been working with a group that is looking at how do we do these universal kinds of things going into school, because we have to look at every student right now with the possibility of them having trauma going through this. So yes, so you know, trauma-informed classrooms is kind of moving to healing-centered engagement for every classroom. And part of that would definitely be strategies related to mindfulness.
Right. I'm really pleased to hear that. So I look forward to seeing where your research goes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. Anybody else?
So let me just say, if there's something that I can do along the way, if you've got some questions, it was, now on this side, it feels more fun. Back then it felt pretty stressful, but I'd be happy to share some of the things that I've learned along the way.
Yeah, Kathy, I want to thank you for both the content of the talk, but also, you know, your attention to thinking about the students who are part of the audience and helping them understand the complexity of carrying out research and things that can go as planned and things that might not be quite quite what you planned. So thank you all, and we'll give a virtual applause, and we'll see everybody next week. So thank you all for attending, and thanks so much, Kathy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye, everybody.
I don't know what happened there. All of a sudden, it was like
You get
you
really excited about what you're talking about. It's fine. It happens. All right. So I'll go with the PowerPoint you sent me then.
I can just send you the other one that has because I added the takeaway stuff to the end. So
okay.
I'll just send it to you right now if you want, and then you.
Okay, and then if you want to do that model thing,
yeah,
whenever your printer
like
works or whatever.
Now I have time to try and see if I can figure out what's going on with my printer.
Okay, cool.
All right.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.